Overfishing is threatening fish stocks. According to Greenpeace, we've already removed at least 2/3 of the large fish in the ocean, and 1 in 3 fish populations have collapsed since 1950. Our oceans are acidifying due to greenhouse gas emissions, which is killing coral reefs and destroying the habitats of a whole host of different aquatic animals. And pollution in the form of agricultural runoff, chemical spills, sewage, as well as plastics contamination are also threatening marine life. So the problem is big, but we're here today to talk about solutions that have the potential to fix them. The panel is going to last for about half an hour of conversation here, and then I'm going to open it up to questions for about 15 minutes. So, be thinking as you listen. And without further ado, I'd just like to welcome this wonderful group of panelists and ask you each to introduce yourselves and tell us a little bit about the organization that you're here from. Yeah.
Okay. I am Norah Eddy. I'm the founder of Salty Girl Seafood. We are a Santa Barbara-based food company, and we have a product, Salmon Bites, that gets the perfect protein on kids and families' plates across the country. And so it's a wild Alaska salmon product, which is basically the best thing you can eat as far as I'm concerned. And it's made with hidden veggies and gluten-free oats. And our company was launched with a desire to drive positive change in the seafood industry. I'm a marine biologist turned entrepreneur. So I come to the food industry as a newbie, but thanks for having me.
Great, thanks, my name is Pete Malinowski, and I'm here with the Billion Oyster Project. And the Billion Oyster Project is a local nonprofit, and our goal is to restore a sustainable oyster population in New York Harbor, and to do all that work with public school students. So we hold the goals of environmental restoration and the goals of public education as equal goals, and we think that the best way to improve outcomes for young people is to engage them directly in the restoration of their local marine environment, and the best way to improve the outcomes of the local marine environment is to train a new generation of young people to take on that responsibility of caring and protecting the resource.
Hi, my name is Julie Chu. I'm the marketing director for Australis Barramundi, which is downstairs, and the Better Fish on Instagram. So Australis specializes in farming barramundi, which is a type of sea bass that has really exceptional culinary, health, and sustainability attributes. We farm in open ocean pens and we're the first to earn the best choice rating by Monterey Bay Aquarium Seafood Watch.
Hi, I'm Shawn, founder of Sea to Table. We're right here in Brooklyn, and we work with fishermen and commercial docks all over the country, shipping what they catch directly to restaurants, to healthy fast casual groups, university, corporate, and campus dining, as well as meal kits. And this year we got into home delivery, and really delivering what's caught here on our shores, all U.S. wild, traceable, and sustainable fish, directly overnight to people that really care about the fish they eat.
Great, thanks guys. So I want to start off by talking to Pete, because 3 of you are in the business of selling fish for consumers to eat. And Pete works with oysters, but correct me if I'm wrong, those oysters are not intended for human consumption.
Right, our oysters are poisonous.
Right, that's what I thought. It's an important distinction. So tell us a little bit about why oysters are so important to a healthy marine ecosystem.
The easiest way to think about it is to think of oyster reefs like coral reefs. They provide all the same ecosystem services that coral reefs provide. The main difference is that, there's 2 main differences. One is that the fish that swim around coral reefs are more brightly colored, so more people care about them. And the other big difference is that a temperate ecosystem, temperate estuaries, are many orders of magnitude more productive than a tropical sea. So there's way more biomass per cubic meter in New York Harbor than there is in a coral reef off Bonaire somewhere. And the oyster reefs in New York Harbor used to support a vast and productive ecosystem, so much that when Europeans first arrived, you couldn't see the surface of the water because there were so many fish, and you couldn't see the sky because there were so many birds. Right? And the oyster reefs that provided all of that provide the habitat and the food to support that ecosystem. So what we're trying to do is put oysters back in the water because they provide food and habitat for other animals. They filter the water, they can protect against storm surge, and they're the base of the whole ecosystem.
Yeah, so you mentioned filtering water. In a sense, oysters are kind of the most primitive technology that we're going to talk about today, because rather than something that's man-made, they're a beautiful and very ancient way of keeping water clean. So what were the challenges that you faced when you tried to sort of reseed New York Harbor with oysters?
Let's see, there's lots of... identifying places in the harbor where the shoreline and sort of bottom topography is appropriate for oysters is a challenge. We have 600 miles of coastline, but the vast majority has been turned into a vertical bulkhead with a fence. And so New Yorkers don't identify as being as living on the water, as living in a port city and being engaged directly with the ecosystem. And a big reason for that is the physical structure of our waterfront. And so even here, we can see the water, but actually getting out and touching the water would be a challenge. And so getting to a point where New Yorkers are sort of networks and friends and supporters and students think about themselves living on the water and breaking the land-water barrier and getting in the water was a first big challenge. So, and then getting permission to put oysters in the water is really hard. So all the rules and permit requirements for putting oysters in the water are the same as if you're putting a bridge in the water. And they're all designed to prevent damage to the natural environment, but there's no permission path in place to create permission for positive things to go into the environment. So we permit oyster reefs like someone would permit a bridge being built. And it's an incredibly arduous and slow process.
So preventing storm surges and purifying the water with oysters seems like this incredibly elegant solution. How scalable do you think it is in the sense of how many different environments could you imagine oysters filling this role in?
Well, there are oyster restoration projects in most coastal states. So the concept of restoring oysters to the water is not new. Our innovation is sharing the goals of restoration and education equally and not restoring oysters if we can't do it in a way that's accessible to young people. And that is slower, more expensive, and less efficient, but we think it's more meaningful and the right way to do it. As far as scale, I think that the type of scale where oyster reefs would be protecting the land is a pretty massive scale, and certainly way more than 1 billion oysters to get to that point. But I think there is great strength in the model of restoring a keystone species through education programs. And you can imagine that existing in any coastal state with a oyster restoration project, but also in any forest or in any salt marsh, right? Finding that keystone species and then focusing a restoration effort through developing curriculum and training teachers, and I think that is a model that is replicable anywhere people live on or near a degraded natural ecosystem, which is everywhere people live.
And is making is making the water clean enough that these oysters could be harvested and eaten a goal at all, or is that not even something that's in your head?
I think that there's time to think really hard about whether or not we should be eating wild animals. And just how you started the panel sort of alluded to that a little bit. I mean, we don't eat wild land animals anymore in mass, and that's because there's none left and they can support it. And we're sort of getting to that point in the oceans also. I love eating oysters. Julie can attest to that. She has seen me personally eat thousands of oysters. But
hopefully not all at once.
There's oysters and oyster reefs have a much more important job to do than to eat food for people. We wouldn't be having this conversation about coral reefs. Like, can we eat coral reefs? No. Like, they have a much more important job to do, and everyone knows that. We just aren't at the point where everyone knows that about oyster reefs. So I think if you want to eat oysters, please do, and please go. There are thousands of oyster farms on the East Coast that have beautiful, clean, pristine, delicious oysters, and all of those oyster farms provide all the same ecosystem services that our oyster reefs do. And the only reason they're there is because people eat their oysters. It's one of the best things you can do for the environment is eat farmed oysters.
So this is a perfect segue to Julie, who the topic of whether or not we should be eating wild animals. So Julie, the fish farming is, I think, kind of a confusing idea to a lot of consumers. They are vaguely aware that some farms are not responsible and don't really know whether buying farmed seafood is something they should or shouldn't be doing. Obviously, it has the potential to take pressure off of wild species. So tell me a little bit about how Australis has approached farming to make it as sustainable as possible and sort of the role technology plays there.
Sure. So to start from the beginning, my CEO and co-founder of Australis, Josh Goldman, started raising fish from his college dorm room, and with always a vision of being able to sustain himself as well as his friends and try and scale it up to a place where we can produce a healthy, lean protein with minimal environmental impact. So I think once he started in aquaculture, he actually first raised tilapia, and he sincerely apologizes because that industry has gotten into kind of just a situation where there were a lot of new things that people haven't done before that just wasn't done in the best way. Later he evolved to striped bass, but ultimately went on this journey to find the right fish in the right location where you can farm it at scale, sustainably, and socially responsibly too. So for us, we're unique in this space in that we're kind of like the Dimin branch of fish, and that we control everything from hatchery to harvest, and we're able to tell you this is the livelihood of the fish, this is where it came from, this is what they're eating, this is how we harvest them, and then taking that all the way to the processing and how we manage that as well. So for us, Barramundi is a relatively unknown species in the US, and our biggest goal is to try and first, I guess it's twofold, try and get people familiar with this species of fish, but also convince people that we are doing this in the best possible way. Clearly that has been the uphill battle for a long time, but I think because we are certified by third-party organizations such as Best Aquaculture Practices, Global Gap, recognized by Moderator by Seafood Watch, that gives a little bit of end-user trust, if you will. So that's sort of how we try and differentiate ourselves from all just like the world of farm fish. For consumers, I think you really have to know your farmer, know your farmer the same way you know your local farmer, know your fish farmer.
So remind me where your farms are.
So we have two operations. The first one, the original one, is still in Western Massachusetts. It's an on-land closed containment system, which we use recirculating aquaculture. All that fish is serving a very niche market in the US. It's being sold live into specialty Asian retail and food service companies. That's sort of a specialty right now. Our larger operation and the place where serves all of our retail, Blue Apron, as well as food service, is coming from Ban Phong Bay, Vietnam. It's in central Vietnam, and the farms are 6 miles offshore, as I mentioned, which I'm going to next week.
So you mentioned when we were talking earlier that the fish is flash frozen and it's shipped to the U.S. And so one of the things that, again, 3 of the panelists do here is that you use freezing as part of your business model to try to get fish from point A to point B in the best possible condition. And I think freezing is, a lot of consumers have a sort of memory of frozen seafood from the 70s and 80s, the gross kind of freezer burn and bad quality, and have avoided frozen fish because they feel like it's inferior quality. But I think 3 of you probably have good stories to tell about why freezing is actually a really important technology in promoting sustainable seafood. So I don't know who wants to start with. Maybe Norah, who came the longest distance to be here from Santa Barbara. Too.
Sure. Yes, so freezing, a lot of people do have that perception around frozen seafood that it's subpar to fresh fish. Fresh fish in quotation marks. So typically, in the days of old, a lot of seafood counters would wait till the very last leg of their fresh fish counter and then freeze it in a traditional freezer, and it was fish that was at the end of its life cycle anyway. So, that's where that kind of sketchy quality came from. Most of the fish that we're talking about, that we're working with, is what's called flash frozen. It's frozen in very, very super cold freezing process that locks in that freshness and that high quality. It basically freezes the fish in time. And what's kind of funny to me about consumer perceptions around frozen fish is that when you talk to fishermen, Shawn, I'm sure you can attest to this, every fisherman in Alaska has a freezer full of their summer catch. Fishermen all across the states freeze their fish because it's the best way to have fresh fish all year round. As long as you're freezing it as soon as it's caught or as close to landing as possible, it's the highest quality fish around.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I grew up fishing on these waters here. My grandparents are just out from Point Lookout, which is right by Jones Beach. And you ate fresh fish when you caught it. And that's about how often you eat fresh fish, because you never really go to the grocery store. It's so hard to find a good piece of fish. And it's really frustrating. There's lots of more questions than answers. And what I realized is that as I started working with fishermen and shipping to chefs, I still only eat fresh fish when I intercept a box that's going to a restaurant, because it's nice. But I feed my family every day the same way, that fishermen do, is that you get fish that's caught right there, you cut it into fillets or portions, and you freeze it really quickly. And you'll even vacuum seal it, and you'll keep it at very low temperatures. And then when you're ready to eat, in the morning you take it out of your freezer, you leave it out into the refrigerator and let it refresh over time, and it's delicious. And it's simple, and it's easy, and it's a no-brainer. And it's something that chefs across the country already do. It's like almost a secret they don't want to tell you. But what it allows you to do is it allows you to utilize some technology. We're here talking about food and tech. And seafood industry really hasn't changed that much. Nobody's going to come out here and tell you that there's some gizmo or gadget that's changed the world. But you have to leverage technology, and you have to implement it in the right places. And one thing we did is we started working with fishermen down the coasts of America. In one area in New Bedford, Massachusetts, they have a thriving fishery of scallops. Really an expensive fish or shellfish that commands a good price, brings a lot of money to that community, and allows them to invest into infrastructure, into liquid nitrogen freezing tunnels. Something that wasn't around 10, 15, 20 years ago. And these are Willy Wonka conveyor belts that bring fish or anything you put through them down to negative 180 degrees Fahrenheit in 3 minutes. And what we do is we work with fishermen catching non-traditional species that are abundant on these coasts, and then put it through these tunnel freezers, so that we can take the fish that are here and being caught here and healthy and sustainable, put them into a form that's readily usable, and then get them out to markets that appreciate it. So again, frozen fish, you guys are going to learn, if you haven't already, that it's the same thing as taking berries in season and freezing them, or getting a connection to a farmer that's going to give you a quarter cow or some portions of really good pork that you can feel good about, is that it allows you to take a sustainable wild resource and put it through the year in a low-cost method that's super delicious, super healthy, and that is convenient. So it's really the way of the future.
So audience members who might have now been convinced about the relationship between freezing and quality might still not understand the relationship between freezing and sustainability. So can one of you help make that connection a little bit? Why does freezing technology make it easier for somebody who's selling seafood to tick the sustainability boxes that need to be ticked?
So one big thing is food waste. And seafood, fresh seafood in your traditional retailer commands a lot of that waste that just gets discarded because no one's buying it quick enough. And I think having frozen seafood really solves that problem, where you are just using what you need and then storing the rest for later. For us, I think that has played a tremendous role in reducing food waste, as well as, because we are able to freeze it, we can actually ship our product from Vietnam to the US by container. And so that takes about a month, but because it's frozen, it is just perfectly fine, and we're not spending the air freight in cost or in carbon miles, if you will.
Great. So another big, I think, buzzword in the seafood industry right now is traceability. Something that I've done some reporting on recently, and this idea that we don't always have very good visibility as consumers, or we actually usually do not have very good visibility as consumers into where our fish has, what the sort of chain our fish has traveled along to reach our dinner plates, which makes it hard to have confidence in the fact that it is sustainable. So can any of you, and I think actually traceability came from the oyster world originally, Pete, is that right? I mean, I know that oysters have been required to be traced for like decades.
Yeah, I know. I don't know other fish like I know oysters, so I don't know if it was the first, but certainly tags go with every shipment, every bag, every box of oysters to the restaurant or retail place where they're sold that says the harvest date and the location, which specific bed they came from. And that's been for a long time.
Which might not sound that impressive, but I think kind of unbelievably for most other fish that actually doesn't happen. There's no documentation that traditionally follows the fish. So can any of you talk a little bit about how you use traceability to kind of ensure sustainability in your supply chain?
Sure, so I can speak to that, and then I'm sure you guys will have things to say as well. So the way that our company operates is a little different than Shawn's operation at Sea to Table in a sense, where you're buying from multiple fishermen all across the country. You have lots of moving parts. For us, we're creating a retail ready product that's sold in Whole Foods and retailers around the country. So what we're doing is buying large quantities of fish from a group of fishermen or a single fisherman at one time. And so we have kind of this one-to-one, and we use Trace Register, which is just a platform that we're communicating with our suppliers, and receiving and sharing all of our data that way. So we don't have as many moving parts as many other players in the seafood industry do. But part of the problem or part of the reason that traceability is such a big deal in seafood is that if you don't know where your fish is coming from, you have no idea if it's coming from a source that is well managed, or, in a lot of the United States fisheries, we're very fortunate here to have very effective management in the States, or if your fish is coming from some fishery that's very poorly managed. And we take the stance that you want to be part of the solution, not part of the problem. So you want to be making sure that that fish is traceable back to a sustainable source, a well-managed fishery.
Yeah, traceability is such a buzzword now, but in the farm to table movement, or the way that people think about how to source their food, it's not a new concept. But seafood's always been a fishy business. I mean, a lot of people from New York here. Yeah, right? So the Fulton Fish Market, which moved from downtown all the way up to the Bronx, notorious. It's like a gangster hangout, and it's where they did their business. And this isn't just about like modern day New York. Fishermen are really secretive by nature. Like, I don't want to tell you where I was fishing. And that kind of goes up the chain, right? And then you got the guys who buy the fish and from them, and who ship the fish to a market, who sell it to another guy, and you somehow almost value that information piece. And what we did is we broke all those walls down, and we started to source directly, because at this point, there's very little you can trust in an opaque chain, and that you have to verify for yourself. So even working with over 50, I think 56, 57 different fishing communities around the country, from individual fishermen to commercial docks landing a number of boats, you can get that information. And then it's about how does it travel. And when we pack into meal kit companies, or when we pack for home delivery into consumer portions, we put a little sticker label that has not just what the species is, not just what the Latin name is, but the management region it was caught in, the vessel it was caught from, and if possible, we put the captain's name too. And it's just straight Brooklyn, like, what's your chicken's name? It's way too much information. But whatever gets people feeling comfortable, feeling good about fish, will get them to start trusting and eating more fish. Because we really are doing a lot of things on our coasts here that are great. And the feeling about sustainability is changing, at least in the US and US waters. And it's something to support, it's something to look for and to vote for with your fork. So as long as you have that information, I trust people want to make the right choice. They want to support a verified fishery. But it's about carrying that information through the chain is the difficult part. It's more difficult to be simple in this business.
So I guess we only have a few minutes left before we open it up for questions. So I wanted to ask, any of you who feel like you have an answer, what the biggest technological barrier is that you feel like you face. What piece of technology do you think is right on the horizon in your industry, or that if you could, wave a magic wand, would change the way you do your business or you run your organization? I know that I talked to Shawn at one point, I think in the spring, to try to figure out how tech was transforming the seafood world, and I think you told me that installing internet at docks was transformative. So this is sort of I think the technological bar is pretty low in most fishing communities. But do any of you have thoughts on this?
I think there's a lot of advancements. We work in a dinosaur age industry for sure. Seafood is very old school. But the great thing is there's innovators like ourselves that are trying to disrupt that. And talking about internet at docks, the majority of docks around the country are still literally collecting our catch data with pen and paper in old school logbooks. And that data is being transcribed by some, post-grad in an office at National Marine Fisheries typing in what some captain logged at sea. So there's still massive advancements to be made just in data collection alone. And I think that will serve us well here in the United States as we're creating these robust management systems, but also have trickle-down effects in the developing world where we really need to have stronger enforcement and stronger management.
I think, we live at a time when we're just getting to the point where data is accessible, but developing a fluency with that data is something that is still a barrier to entry for a lot of people. Like, we can go on NOAA's website and get all of the weather data from around the world, but making sense of that is really hard. We're in the process of developing right now for our schools program is an online platform that will allow students that allows students to upload their data from their oyster cages and compare their data to other cages around the city. So if you're a student in Staten Island, you can compare growth data and water quality data to a student in the Bronx. And that, I think, as a student develop fluency with those different data points and what that means about water quality, they develop sort of a deep understanding of the natural system. And I think for us generally, just people in the world and New Yorkers, understanding, being able to take, we have these great environmental challenges that are coming our way, but it's really hard to make them feel present and immediate. And getting to a point where we can understand the data that supports it and speak well about it is a really, it's like the next step in that process.
So I think from a aquaculture production standpoint, what I'm personally most excited about is just the emergence of polyculture in, on fish farms and even on oyster farms. There are some oyster farms and fish farms who raise seaweed as a co-product. We actually do on our farm where the seaweed helps absorb the excess nutrients in the water. But systems like that could mimic things that actually take place in nature would be really exciting to see in the future.
I'm actually surprised you guys invited me because I'm a very low-tech person. But we run a fairly sophisticated ERP software that allows us to coordinate amongst all these different ship points, all these customers, to be able to carry the traceability through. But I think there's a simple solution out there somewhere. And just sitting here and thinking of your question, what came to mind was the impact that those handheld undercover video cameras had in the CAFOs and the industrial feedlots of cattle, and how it changed people's perceptions of this agro-industrial model. And if we knew what we were eating on our plates as far as seafood goes, over 90% of the seafood we eat in this country is imported. Up to a third is mislabeled. And they've really had AP Pulitzer Prize winning articles come through linking slavery, modern day slavery, to seafood supply chains. If we knew what we were eating, if there was some just little flip of our consciousness, we would demand a better choice. And we wouldn't tolerate an industry to continue in the way it is. And so everyone on this panel is doing great things, big steps in the right direction, aquaculture and wild sustainable fisheries. But it really takes a broad-based movement of understanding, and I'm not sure it's an industry technological fix. It might be as simple as reading an article, Liz, or seeing something online. So no silver bullet, but it's an idea.
So I'd like to open it up at this point for questions. Does anybody have any questions for the panelists? Yeah.
So you were just talking about, if there were more exposés, what was going on, it would probably take people. But I think part of the issue with the farm was this is what's going on in your own backyard, plus the consumption of the meat and all that is dramatically higher than in fish. So what would you imagine would happen that people would do exposés in foreign countries, go undercover on boats, or what would you imagine would be the perfect exposé?
Did everyone hear the question, by the way?
No.
She was asking what would be the perfect expose. What is it you think needs to, float to the surface for things to change. And the amazing thing is, it's just beneath the surface. The information's there, the stories are there. It's just now coming to our own caring and consciousness. Again, if you look at the numbers of how the seafood industry works, we import over 90% of the seafood we eat in this country. We export a great deal of what we catch. You could argue about farm, you could argue about wild. That food system's broken. It doesn't make sense. No other center plate protein do we rely on such an international commodity market with so few regulations and transparency. So it's really just about people starting to think, where's my fish come from? And asking the questions and having the uncomfortable conversation. But that's going to be a big, big driver, and it's already started.
And to build on that point, I think 80% are of just 4 or 5 different species. So shrimp being the first one, the salmon, tilapia, cod might be 4. Tuna. Yeah, so I think another way to create better change is to diversify your fish intake portfolio, if you will. Just trying new species, find fish, some chefs have this mantra of choose the dish, not the fish. Almost, so whatever the fishermen are bringing in, try it. It doesn't have to be cod, it could be like cod in a completely different type of species that is totally delicious.
Pink shirt.
I have a question. I understand that we're talking about the richness in other countries, especially countries that are not speaking English. How do you communicate these kind of changes that you want to create in other developing countries, knowing where their fish is coming from, making sure that the fish is accessible and affordable for developing countries? And will that, do you think you can create a system where they're able to have accessible and affordable fish and decrease the cost for developing countries?
That's a great question. I'm happy to jump in. So that's something that Salty Girl was largely launched based on the work that I've done in the developing world in fisheries, in particular in Ecuador. Kind of recognizing that for many of the developing world's fisheries that are the fisheries in the most need of reform effectively, a lot of what those fisheries need is a market-based incentive. So they need a partner who can come in if enforcement is non-existent or if enforcement is very limited. Fishermen require adequate financial incentives in order to transition their fishing practices to ones that are more sustainable, let's say. And so businesses can step in and basically be the link that connects these fisheries to a market that values sustainability and serve as the driver to change that behavior and in turn have broader ecological impacts. Local food security and local supply chain dynamics are always or should always be a concern when US-based businesses or European businesses are moving in to source product from these fisheries. So oftentimes what's happening is that we have NGOs, there are global NGOs that are basically boots on the ground, and ideally those NGOs are working with a local conduit to make sure that the kind of local supply chain dynamics remain intact and we're not removing a valuable protein source from those communities. But that's a great question.
Well, what about cost as well, making sure that that does not be affected?
Right, so is the presence of a new player in the market driving up the cost? Yeah, that's definitely a concern. I don't think I have a good answer to that. It's definitely a risk when you introduce a new player. I'm not sure if you guys, Shawn, I know you don't do international necessarily, but Julie, I don't know if you have a...
I think it's an interesting question thinking internationally, but we can also think locally, right? We're like nobody in this room represents the average consumer in the United States of America, right? Anyone who's plugged into any of these conversations are not the people whose diet needs to change for mass consumer, for the vast majority of these challenges to be fixed. And I think all of them at the outset represent boutique products, right? Like expensive food. So I think it is a really big challenge making sustainable food accessible to the masses, sort of the quickest way to make it unsustainable.
So I would actually counter that point though, because when you think about sustainable fisheries, right, you have wild Alaska salmon, which is in fisheries, in seafood, sustainability does not necessarily mean a price premium. So Shawn, you work with dogfish, right? And that's a sustainable species, but your price point is not something that puts the average consumer in America out. Our product is being sold in Target stores across the states and in the Midwest. So we are targeting, not to say target, but a very much the slice of middle America. So not to conflate a high price point with sustainability in seafood.
But you don't think that generally a high price point is associated with sustainable seafood?
I think that it should not be.
Right. Should not, may not, but I would say generally, almost entirely is. That if you look for the healthier food you eat, the more sustainable it is. In general, I'm sure there's exceptions all over the place. You're talking about a more expensive product.
Well, consider that McDonald's fish fillet comes from a sustainable pollock fishery in Alaska. That's a pretty mainstream, very large scale outlet at a very low price point.
Well, yeah, I'm sure there's exceptions, but I think I'm surprised to hear that there's not, you don't think there's a link between sustainable and organic Monterey Bay checked off fish and a price premium in general.
I'll jump in there as well in that it's just starting.
Yeah.
And a lot of times it starts at one level. And really, I credit a lot of fantastic chefs around the country for adopting this change into their menus and beginning the conversation with diners and allowing that conversation to really broaden out. And the answer is not simple. It's a really difficult question, and it's a very real problem. I mean, over 2 billion people in this world rely on seafood protein as their main protein intake. And as a world commodity, as an international market, you're taking from here to give to there, right? It's not a zero-sum game. But what we need to do is we need to find solutions. And Julie, you pushed on this, is that we primarily as Americans eat 4 species, right? Shrimp, farm salmon, cod, and canned tuna. And we need to broaden our palates. We need to be able to eat what's available to us. And we do. We catch only about 25 million pounds of dogfish, a small coastal shark, between Massachusetts and North Carolina, sustainably to the maximum sustainable yield in the biomass to nerd out on everybody. We could catch 50 million pounds and not affect the population. But there's not enough appetite for this fish. And almost all of it gets exported to Spain, France, Italy. We're literally not eating what's available and what's affordable because we think we need to eat these more expensive species. Now, flip this dynamic, change the thought process, work towards a better future, and hopefully one day it is affordable across the country and it's affordable across the world, that the balance is reached and we get to a better path. But we're not there yet. It's just beginning.
Yes, Jean Jacket.
Thanks guys for being here today. I think it's really interesting that there's a mix of you guys on the stage. Some of you work with wild fish and some of you are farming your own fish, and I would be interested to hear a little bit more of a conversation between you guys in terms of both environmental and health benefits of one versus the other. Are we looking at a future of a combination and a balance of the two, and what that looks like?
So we're definitely already there. Julie, not to steal your thunder, but aquaculture has surpassed wild capture fisheries in terms of feeding the human population across the world. So we're there. But I'll let you.
I was gonna say, my biggest pet peeve is always saying wild versus farmed. It's gotta be wild and farmed. I mean, just from the numbers perspective, wild seafood, as much as I love it, can't feed the world population growing up. Aquaculture has to step in to meet that increasing demand. But you can only do that and also everything else if you do it responsibly. So I think it's really about,
finding the people in wild and farm that are doing the right thing and that are working together, that are supporting each other to really raise consumer consciousness about this is what you should look for, whether it's local or foreign, whether it's fresh or frozen. Just that's sort of the conversation where I like to be having, and I like to always exchange notes with people in wild and in other farm fish companies.
Just curious if any of you could speak about the role of regulation in all of this, both domestically and internationally. We have foreign fishermen wiping out fish populations everywhere, taking away from local coasts along Africa, stuff like that. You mentioned you're not taking your full biomass of dogfish that you could, and we can't necessarily fish everything to the limits, and you guys are also in touch with a lot of fishermen who would probably argue there's plenty of fish, get the government the hell off my boat, let me fish, right? That's the general attitude of most fishermen I know. They hate regulation, but without it, we're going to screw ourselves over pretty badly. I mean, I'm psyched that the cod father got caught in New Bedford, of all examples, right? Because he was messing with the quotas for years. So is there hope for regulation to hit a point where it's trusted with the fishermen and fishermen trust the government and vice versa, that they're working? I know that there are examples of good communities, like the Maine lobster community tends to be parroted as like the best or whatever, but I don't know, I'm curious what you guys all think. I see smirks and reactions, so.
Just smiling, guys. Reese Pacheco, he's actually from New England, big Portuguese fishing community out there, and he comes from a family, I've known him from college actually, and surprised to see you, good to see you, Reese. He comes from a family that...
I wasn't planted here to like...
Yeah, what is this, Shawn?
I'm just interested.
It's softball, thanks man. There's a fishing community that are heavily affected by the regulations of what they're allowed to catch or how much they're allowed to catch. And there's always an inherent battle between these entrepreneurial, free-spirited fishermen who want to go out and catch and earn for their family, and science-based organizations that want to protect wild fish stocks. And it's a very healthy conflict. I think it's absolutely necessary. And there's a lot of hope there. We turned around in this country overfished populations and an industry that was absolutely running on its own accord in about 20 years with the Magnuson-Stevens Act. The Magnuson-Stevens Act. It's an act of Congress from 1976 that said by the year 2010, all U.S. fisheries must be managed sustainably. And while it's a federal law, it's actually implemented by the different regional management councils, and within those management councils of the states, the local and federal work together. And it's a very bureaucratic, confusing piece of legislation. But what it did was, it worked. But it was harsh. It put a lot of fishermen out of business. It basically said this is a finite resource, and unless you have the catch histories to prove you're a real player in this resource, you can't come back in. And it makes it an exclusive fishery, but it protects it from a tragedy of the commons, where everyone will come in and try to grab as much as they can, competing with each other until it's all gone. And I think one of those conflicts in regulation is that it's that kind of old school meets new school. A lot of these scientists are using very sophisticated machinery because, I don't know if you guys know this, you can't really count fish in the ocean like you can count trees in a forest. You can't just like walk around and point and say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So they're using benthic sonar technology. They're using highly sophisticated algorithms over seasonal catches at different depths. And then you're talking to a fisherman who can close his eyes and tell you exactly what the bottom looks like 300 feet down because he's fished that piece of water for generations. And as you start to marry these two concepts of old school, new school, technology and inherent knowledge, and the trust begins, because the fisherman knows he's in a protected fishery where he has a future, that's where regulations really start to work and take off. And the US has the best managed fisheries in the world. Australia might be right behind it, but more and more countries need to adopt this science-based approach. and to be able to trust between harvesters and environmentalists.
Yeah, I think that's an important point to note that that Shawn and Norah work with U.S. fish, U.S. caught fish, not just because it's great to do local, but because the United States does an exceptional job of managing our fisheries. So if you have a choice about buying wild fish, you can feel pretty good about buying domestic fish. I think I'm going to take one last question, and I think we have to wrap up. So.
Shifts in fish distribution caused by climate change, is something that you confronted in your practice, or that you're sort of needing to adjust or plan for going forward?
It's something that we haven't dealt with too much. In Alaska, Alaska and the Pacific Northwest, the salmon runs are dependent on El Nino events and PDSO, so large oceanographic and climatological events over a series of several years. But I'm sure you guys have experienced on the East Coast. I know there's quite a bit of movement.
Did everyone hear the question? Which was basically, are issues of climate change changing fish distribution? And that could have been taken like literally as like fish swimming around the ocean, or it could have been taken like what we do, which is sling fish. Hugely so. Warmer waters creeping in, fish like colder waters, because colder water is more productive, they're shifting north. And what happens is the fishermen can no longer catch what they've traditionally caught. One of the reasons Atlantic cod is no longer available is partly overfishing, it's partly climate change. What they ate is getting pushed out, so they get pushed out. And my message to that is, let's open our minds and stay flexible of the different kinds of seafood we can eat, because fish are still a wild population. We literally go out and hunt them. They're totally susceptible to environmental impact, and if we're part of a warming climate, we have to be accepting of the new fish that move into our waters. And if we want to eat sustainable, wild, traceable, healthy fish, I don't think so much about what you've always eaten. Think about what's there, what's affordable, what's available, what's sustainable, and just come in with an open mind.
So we have a kind of an advantage with barramundi because it is a fish that thrives in the marine tropics. So the hotter it is, the better that it actually does. And the marine tropics is probably the most underrated aquaculture zone that we should still tap into more. It's actually not nutrient dense in the same way that the North and South Poles are for salmon farming. It's actually very clear water, so you're not impacting like a very sensitive habitat in the first place. But as our water's warm, there's more opportunity to grow specific types of species in that warm water that do well. So for us, it's yay.
I'll just say quickly that the associated changes in the pH are actually more dramatic in shellfish than temperature. So the more acidic water can prevent oysters from forming their shell, which is something that was a big deal on the West Coast until all the hatcheries on the West Coast started treating all of their incoming water. So now, in order to grow oysters, you have to raise the pH of water coming to hatcheries on the West Coast.
Thank you all for being here. Hopefully you'll stick around for a few minutes if anybody else has questions. I know there were hands that we didn't get to, so thank you so much, and thanks to the audience.